9. In a forest clearing a short distance from Menemanera, the other members had already congregated ahead of us. Thanks to Asana's formidable persuasion skill, I saw Agile's bro squad, Shivada, Litten, and the other players from each guild, wearing their respective colors. I'd asked the two of them to recruit members if possible, expecting to be futile, so this was a pleasant surprise. Neza went off to pay his respects to Asana and the others, so I approached Shivada's group. Sorry for being so late, I was going to say, but the large DKB member with Shivada spun around ferociously and grabbed me by the collar. "Hey there, Nightwing," said Hafner, a greatsword user, sub-leader of the DKB, calling me by a nickname that referred to my outfit. He leaned in with a menacing face that made me think of a soccer team member and growled, "I'm going to clobber you if it turns out that you told us a single lie about any of this." Setting aside the fact that the anti-criminal code in town and the threat of going orange out of town prevented him from actually clobbering me at all, I nodded obediently. Shivada grabbed Hafner's shoulder with an awkward smile and pulled him back. "Half this idea came from our side. All Kirito offered was info about the guild flag. I don't think he's lying. Why would he? There's nothing for him to gain from it." "Well, you might have a point there, but why would he put together such a dangerous plan? Doesn't he have a good reason to keep the ALS from getting that flag thing?" "Hang on," I interrupted, waving my right hand to cut off the DKB officers. "First of all, the point of this operation isn't to keep the ALS from getting the guild flag. When the flag drops, we can't give it to the DKB either. If either guild gets the flag, it might spell the collapse of the other." It seemed that Shivada had explained this premise to Hafner already. The soccer player scowled, but fell silent. So I took the opportunity to ask, "What about you, Hafner? Are you sure you should be taking part? We're extremely grateful for your help, but as a sub-leader of the DKB, you'll be betraying your own guild." Hafner ruffled his long blonde hair, which was held back at the hairline by a string, and grumbled, "Yeah, I'm not thrilled about it, but beating the game comes first. We need both the DKB and the ALS to get out of this shitty MMO. I can't betray the thousands below who are waiting for freedom, even if it means betraying Lind and my guild. That's why you're here too, right?" That last question was directed towards Litten and the other ALS members, who were standing a short distance away. The mid-sized, mid-build older man, he looked to be in his 30s, carrying a halberd on his back. He drew his faintly whiskered lips together and nodded. "That's right. Our plan to charge ahead is the reckless result of a few hardliners playing the fears of the officers. Cabal knows that, but he was forced to approve the plan to keep the guild from fracturing. But if getting that flag means destroying the already unstable relationship with the DKB, then it means nothing." The halberdier said calmly. He walked over to me and stuck out his hand. "We've met a few times in the boss battles. I'm Okatan, the leader of the ALS recruiting team. Good to work with you, Kirito." Thanks for being here." I was momentarily surprised by his name, which was rather cute for a scruffy-faced dandy like him, but I recovered in a timely enough fashion to shake his hand. However, a thought occurred to me. "So, if you're the head recruiter, does that mean you were the one who scouted Litten for the guild?" "Yep, that was me." The look on his face as he turned back to appraise the plate-armored macer was fatherly. It made me wonder if he realized Litten and Shivada were a couple, but that wasn't for me to bring up. With our greetings out of the way, Hafner slapped me heartily on the back. "Well, Nightwing, me and Oko have explained our motives to the group. Before we get to this shindig on the road, why don't you tell the group why you're leading this charge?" What? I tore my eyes away from the soccer player and saw Asana, Argo, and Neza, Agile, and the bros were all gathered round, waiting to hear my answer. There was no escape. I cleared my throat. "Well, it's the same as Hafner and Okatan, and probably everyone else here. The ALS and the DKB are the two wheels that run our progress forward through the game. And if they aren't attached by the center axle, we will lose one or two. The whole cart is going to grind to a halt. If I figure out the only way to prevent this situation is to beat the boss before the ALS does, and that's why I gathered you all here. Of course, that was barely half of my true motivation. Okutan described the ALS plan as a rampage of hardline minority in a guild, but there was a darker side of the story he didn't know about. There was an external evil that had infiltrated the guild and was fanning the flames of conflict within the DKB, the mysterious Poncho Man and his Provocation PK gang. Stopping them was my true motive. But I couldn't reveal that yet, until I at least knew the names of the other members aside from Morche. Bringing the subject up would only lead to distrust and paranoia within the guilds. Fortunately, everyone aside from Asuna, who already knew the truth, seemed to be satisfied by the speech. Even Hafner, though disgruntled, nodded in agreement. At that point, Lytton raised her hand with a clank, her features hidden once again by the metal visor. She spoke in that androgynous, metallic echo.
Kirito? I've been meaning to ask you, if you were concerned about the state of the group, why didn't you join a guild? I'm certain that given your skill, you'd be placed as party leader in either guild immediately.
A murmur ran through the group. It was an honest question for someone new to the scene, but given that she probably didn't even know the word beater, it would be very difficult to give me a detailed explanation of the touchy situation between me, Kabao, and Lind. After about a second and a half of frantic thinking, I decided to lay the blame for that question at the feet of the two guildmasters. Well, you see, Lind and Kabao said that if me and Asuna were going to join guilds, we'd have to join separately. Another murmur ran through the group, which gave me a brief moment of panic that I'd said something stupid. Red-faced, Asuna wailed, "Why would you say that?"
Yes, I understand. That's beautiful.
Meanwhile, Agile bellowed with laughter and Argo crackled. In the end, I wasn't given the opportunity to plead my case against her misinterpretation. By the time Argo had divvied up all the potions and everyone had lent and borrowed gear until each slot had the highest stats possible, it was just getting to be about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. According to Okutan, the ALS would leave Menemenera for the tower, pretending to be leaving the party for Caerluine at around 6 o'clock, which gave us a 3-hour advantage. Even with the scouting run, it would likely take 3 hours to fight the boss, so we had plenty of time. Still, it didn't hurt to ration it carefully. So I left Argo to be our guide and ran along the back of the group with Asuna, jotting down a loose estimated breakdown of the group according to level. Kirito, level 18, one-handed sword, leather armor. Asuna, level 17, rapier, light metal armor. Agile, level 16, two-handed axe, light metal armor. Hafner, level 16, two-handed sword, heavy metal armor. Shivada, level 15, one-handed sword, heavy metal armor, shield. Okutan, level 15, two-handed halberd, light metal armor. Wolfgang, Agile Squad, level 15, two-handed sword, leather armor. Lobaka, Agile Squad, level 15, two-handed axe, light metal armor. Naijian, Agile Squad, level 14, two-handed hammer, heavy metal armor. Lytton, level 13, long mace, heavy metal armor, shield. Neza, level 12, chakram, light metal armor. Argo, level unknown, claws, leather armor. It was a very short list for a floor boss raid party. The path through the woods was lined with the bluish rock that made our group's footsteps ring loudly, but Asuna still heard me mutter and looked over for clarification. What's the about? Well, I made the memo visible and showed it to her. We need to figure out a formation before we get to the Labyrinth Tower, and I'm noticing that we have an awful lot of DPSs. What's a DPS? It means damage dealer, an attacker. Out of the 12 of this list, me, you, Agile, and Hafner, Wolfgang, Lobaka, and Naigen are DPSs. That's more than half. Shivata and Litten are our only true tanks, and Okatan, Neza, and Argo are CCs. CCs? Crowd control responsible for controlling the enemy mobs. These are mages in most other games, but since there's no magic in SAO, it mostly comes down to using debuff sword skills that freeze and weaken monsters. Ah, right. Most of the long-reaching weapons have debuffing skills, noted Asuna, who deftly crossed her arms to think, even as she ran. The momentum pulling her body forward, she murmured to herself the same way I had earlier. If it's just 2 parties, so we can ask Shivata and Litten to be a tank in each, then we split the DPS and the CC between the 2, right? That would be the orthodox method. The thing is, the golem only has direct attacks with its hands and feet, and they're all extremely powerful. The normal attacks are one thing, but even a shield isn't going to stop the skill attacks, so we have to avoid them no matter what. Shivata's experienced, but Litten just joined the guild, and it's a bit scary to push such a difficult role on her, Asuna finished. We groaned together, my arms crossed, too. I glanced at the list again. Even with a simpler lineup of 12 total, there was no single answer. If it was a full raid of 48, the possibilities were limitless, and Lind and Cabal were doing this process for every floor and field boss. The realization brought a wave of newfound respect for the 2, but the goal here was to beat them to the punch. As we grumbled over the quandary, the dead forest around us thinned out, revealing a long stone wall snaking ahead. Its length and breadth was on the scale to remind me of the town of beginnings, but it was not a city on the other side of this fortification. Instead, it was a large maze of the 5th floor, which had to be maneuvered before you could reach the labyrinth tower. There were monsters too, of course, so it would take more than a day or 2 to map it all out. However, as long as you solved a few environmental puzzles, you could take a shortcut on a virtual straight shot through the maze, and we had a helpful companion with us in that regard. I unfolded my arms and sped up to catch Argo, who was at the head of the right column of the group. Miss Argo, is there a map to the maze? You bet! I sighed in relief. The information broker glanced over at me and grinned. And it's piping hot and fresh, so it's worth 5,000 coal, I reckon. What? You're gonna charge me? Argo the claw wielder fighting the boss with you for free, but Argo the information dealer needs to earn a living. I gnashed my teeth, wishing I had done more relic hunting back in Caerluine. No worries. I just thought I'd tease you a bit for that lovey-dovey stuff back there. Argo cackled and winked at me. Yes, I mapped the labyrinth, but you won't need it. What do you mean? You'll see when we get there, she hinted and turned us to the right. The 5th floor labyrinth was in the northeast corner of the floor and the maze, which was 1/3 of the mile in radius, surrounded by a semicircle, which meant that on either end, looming stone wall intersected with the outer aperture of the floor. Argo was leading us towards the southeast end. It took us off the path, so we ran into a few mobs, but with 12 members of each battle would be over in an instant if we fought a full strength. Instead, we used a bit of time to allow for a show of our combinations work, and it was about 3:45 when we reached our destination. Nice work, everyone. That ends the trekking across the wilderness at least, Argo noted, and we gratefully came to a stop. I stretched and glanced around us, taking in the rather desolate sight. To the north loomed the 60-foot wall, and to the south and west there were barren gray wastelands without a blade of grass on them. Beyond that was the dead forest we just traveled through, dyed in monochrome by the lengthening rays of the winter sun. When my eyes rolled to the east, they beheld the expanse of endless sky through the nearby aperture. But the faded grayish-blue color struck me as ominous, not the sweeping majesty of the starry sky that Asa and I saw at Blink and Brink. I turned back to the dark stone wall and looked up. According to the legend that Argo told the group on our trip, at the middle of the giant maze was the secret development center of Ancient Kingdom, and the maze was built to detour outsiders from infiltrating. That only made the massive wall even more foreboding. But to do anything, first we had to somehow get past it. So, where do we get in? I asked our guide, as she chugged lime water, wiped her mouth, and grinned. Argo pulled out something shiny out of her cloak. It was a giant key, about 6 inches long. Whoa, did you get that from the boss quests? Exactly. Argo strode over to the stone wall, spinning the key around her finger with the leather cord it hung on. She leaned close to the rough, weathered blocks, searching for something, then struck the key into a particular gap, turned it with a click. Everyone else murmured in admiration. No doubt, as a part of the wall would open as if by magic, revealing a hidden passage inside. Instead, the stone wall rumbled. A few of the blocks sank into the wall by 6 inches or so. And that was it. Argo, where's the hidden door? There's no hidden door. She stuck the key back into her cloak and put a hand into one of the sunken gaps, and then lifted herself. 10 feet up the wall. I looked up, stunned, to see that the pattern of sunken blocks continued straight up the wall, to the top, like an unconventional ladder. Wait, we have to climb over? Agile noted in a panic. Argo looked down, hanging on by one hand, and grinned cheekily. Uh-oh, does this mean the biggest tough guy in the front runners is actually afraid of heights? I'm not saying that, but you can't laugh off a fall from that height, Alger retorted, and he had a good point. There were many sources of damage in SAO, and the one that everyone agreed was the scariest was fall damage. Next to me, Asuna trembled, no doubt thinking about her fall through the trapdoor in the catacombs. The stone wall was over 60 feet tall, and the ground was dirt mixed with gravel. Anyone who fell from the top had lower HP was in danger of instant death. I decided and was about to ask Argo to wait so we could set up a lifeline, but she spoke up first. Oh, well, here's a special gift for you, just for you, Argo said, one of her eyes closed, and she started generating several large items from her inventory. They fell and bounced softly on the ground. Large cushion for player homes, but which hardly any player was yet rich enough to start bothering with. They were quite light for their size, so she must have packed her inventory with the things. We stacked the cushions high next to the handhold ladder, and Argo fell backwards onto them. She landed with a heavy boom, but hadn't suffered any damage. With the demonstration concluded, she popped up, glanced at me sidelong. I'll go last so I can pick up the cushions before I go. You're up first, key boy. Me? Well, okay. I looked over at Asuna, who made a silent you first gesture. The only skirt wearer present certainly was not eager to climb up with all the gentlemen below. I nodded. I stepped onto the pile of cushions and grabbed onto the wall. Once I got climbing, I noticed the alternatively spaced handholds were quite deep and easy to grip, which made physical processes fairly simple. The real problem was the mental pressure that arose once you're halfway up. I knew that with the cushion stacked below, there was no way I'd die if I fell, but that didn't prevent the cold sweat from forming on my limbs. I scaled the last of the wall, wondering if that sweat was just virtual sensation from the nerve gear or my real body was seeping liquid from my pores too. On the other side of the wall was a narrow walkway, set a bit lower. I hopped over and heaved a sigh of relief and called out to the group below. It's not hard. Just stay calm and you'll be fine. All right. I'd go next, called out Hafner, beginning a 10-minute process that ended with Asuna and Argo. No one ended up falling, but that was probably thanks to the mental reassurance offered by Argo's cushions. It occurred to me that it was a good idea to keep 2 or 3 of those things in my inventory, just in case. I grabbed Argo's hand and she finally made her way to the top and pulled her over. With the wall climbing phase concluded, we traded high fives and turned our gazes north.
You weren't kidding when you said this labyrinth would be a big deal to tackle,
muttered Wolfgang from the Bro Squad. He used the same greatsword category as the DKB's sub-leader did, but while Hafner looked like a heavy knight in his metal armor, Wolfgang's skin-tight leather gave him an air of a veteran mercenary. As he said, it was hard to imagine an easy route through the massive maze stretching out before us, even with a map. The layout seemed different from the beta, so I couldn't even use my old memory as a guide. And the ALS were going to charge through this place at night, without scouting it first? Shivada asked Okatan skeptically. The halberdier, who appeared to be the oldest of the group, nodded awkwardly, his whiskered mouth twisted into an abashed smile.
It's rather embarrassing to admit, but their plan, from what I understand, is we'd have information on the puzzles and traps from the beta testers. The schedule called for the entire process to take an hour.
Asa and I shared a look. It had to be the same beta tester that told them about the guild flag. From the way Okatan spoke, it sounded like this wasn't the fellow guild member, so it likely was one of the cloaked men we ran across in the catacombs, Morche. Which would mean the other man was undercover in the ALS. Given the circumstances, I really wanted to tell Shivada and Hafner and Okatan about this plot to identify the spy, but that was difficult to do with Argo and Agil's team present. Not only that, but we had an urgent question at our plates. If the boss battle went well, I'd suggest a celebration to find the time to bring it up, and told myself. My eye swung right to the massive tower, looming over the labyrinth center. They were all categorized as labyrinth towers, but each floor tower had a different scale and design. So the unifying feature was that they're 300-foot height. So while some were fat and squat with uniform width, the others were narrow and willowy. The 5th floor tower was an orthodox cylinder about a third as wide as it was tall, which put it at the small side. There was a grand entrance door at the base, but the wall we were standing atop stretched from the very edge of the floating castle, all the way up to the tower itself, ending in a small door. In other words, we were getting a shortcut that put us 20% through the tower just as we entered, thanks to Argo's tedious work to completing the boss's quests. We were going to shave a good 2 hours off our time.
Thanks, Argo, I said softly, her curly-haired head swung toward me, blinking in surprise, but it was quickly replaced by her usual sardonic grin.
Don't be silly. We're only getting started.
Good point. I took a deep breath, preparing to move the group forward once more. We traveled in a line down the walkway, atop the stone wall, and took a short break at a small observation deck where the wall connected with the exterior of the tower. The toughest dungeon on the 5th floor was on the other side of the door, so we needed to prepare ourselves. Here you go, everyone. Asa was pulling one of those massive cakes out of her inventory. It was only famous local confection of Mana Manera, but given that you had to know the secret cafe, it was new to most of the group. Hafner and the Bro Squad stuffed handfuls into their mouth, grunting about how damn good it was, while Litton and Shivada got cozy with some forks against the wall. I looked around in alarm for Okatan, but he was already chatting mirthfully with Neza, which caused a different kind of alarm to fill me when I imagined the former blacksmith being recruited into the ALS. With the cake all distributed, Asuna brought me a piece and glanced up at the tower looming overhead as she ate. So it's time? Yeah. I picked up the cake with my fingers and took a bite. The banana flavor, which had been so thick when I ate the same items an hour earlier, hardly seemed to register on my tongue this time. It made me realize just how nervous I was. This was supposed to be our only option to defeat the game of death and escape the electronic prison that bound us. Whether ALS' plan to race ahead was successful or not, it would cause a major rift in the group's advanced players and disperse the collection of energy that had been driving our pace and speeding us along. We would slow down, and players like Litton, who were doing their best to catch up to us from below, would lose hope. Despair would settle upon all of Eingrad. It would be like an eternal night, without glittering stars or rising morning sun. I put the half-eaten cake back onto the plate, surrounded by a sudden wharf of music. I knew it was an illusion, but I shut my eyes to hear it nonetheless. An eerie sight appeared on my closed eyelids. 3 dancing silhouettes lurching against a blood-red sunset to a mad, racing, mocking melody. The hems of pitch-black cloaks and ponchos flapped like bat wings. The mouth of the figure on the right turned visible, displaying a familiar twisted leer. What if my own actions here are an intended result of their provocation? The sudden thought caused my limbs to freeze to ice. Here, on the milestone 5th floor, we would fight a floor boss that was far harder than any previous. I'd warned Asuna about it again and again, and I believed I was preparing myself accordingly. No matter how I rationalized my current actions based on what was happening in the game, I was leading a tiny group of 12 against that boss. There was a way to win. We were going to scout it out vigorously. If there was a problem here, it was that my choice and actions were not based on absolute, rock-solid belief. When I left the town of beginnings, I prioritized my own survival above all else. Asuna and Arga were with me now, but I hadn't developed a new grand ideal like protecting all the captive players of SAO or beating the game with my own 2 hands. Meanwhile, the other players here were participating in this impromptu strategy out of their own strongly held beliefs, with full knowledge of the risk. Hafner, for example, was a man who moved by the priority of beating the game above all else. He moved brusquely to the front of the line, waiting for the gondola ride in Rovia on the 4th floor. But that was surely because he'd been irritated at the tourist. He was thinking of a man who would chastise them for having the energy to enjoy themselves rather than helping attack the game. I understood that feeling, and his current actions spoke to the strength of his belief, given that he was prioritizing this over Guild's profits. Then there was Shavada, whom I only speculate about, but seemed to be here for Litton's sake. I didn't know how it was that they had come together, but they had drawn their swords to ensure their guilds did not come to blows. That was an admirable motive itself. Agil's group, Argo, and Neza all had searched for their own feelings on their own answers as well. So why was I, the guy who spurned the guilds and prioritized his own personal gains, going against my own beliefs not only by participating in this group, but by also leading it? The answer to that had to be antagonism towards Morche and his provocateurs. They had attempted to dual PK me and put Asuna through a terrible fright. And now I was moved by furious determination to keep them from continuing their ways. In that case, I had to admit that it was they who had stoked the fire within me. Was I losing my cool? Was I letting my antagonism and hatred guide me to a reckless strategy that would end up sending me and the people I cared about into their certain death? I realized I was gritting my teeth and staring down at the half-eaten cake. But suddenly, my cold, numb hand was enveloped in pleasing warmth. I looked down to see that the spot hidden from the rest of the group behind my black leather coat was a silk cape. A small, pale hand was gripping my own. I looked up to catch the side profile, the fencer's face. Her expression was the usual aloof, vaguely hostile one, but the undeniable warmth that covered my hand was like touching spring sunlight. I stood there, dumbly, until her pursed lips finally opened. That's for giving me that buff on the camp on the 3rd floor. Oh, right. I forgot about that. I recalled the moment when she'd melted down her wind fleuret to create the chivalric rapier and squeezed my hand back. Why had Asuna agreed to this plan anyway? The story about the guild flag and the competition of the two guilds couldn't have meant this much to her. If she was here, out on her own, unyielding personal belief, what could that possibly be? I wanted to know, but I didn't seem like the right moment to ask. If we defeated the boss and made it back to the town alive, then I'd bring it up, but I would make that my biggest motivation to fight and win. With that determination in mind, the foreboding music that had been ringing away in the back of my head finally faded, along with the eerie dancing silhouettes. Without letting go of Asuna's hand, I lifted the paper plate up to my face and flipped it over to dump the rest of the cake into my mouth. I chewed and looked up to the tower again. It was a darker shade of stone that made up the ruin here, the left side lit by the midwinter sun. Gleaming coldly, it was as if the countless monsters inside and the menace of the floor boss was to be exuding like a frost. But the heat of Asuna's hand flowed through all my veins, keeping the chill at bay. I squeezed it one last time and then let go and lowered my face into its normal level. Immediately, I began smirking gaze at Argo and had to cough awkwardly and clear my throat before I could step forward to address the group. Well, everyone, I think it's time to announce my idea about our group formation. Once the party had finished eating its cake and gathered around, I explained, A team will be with Hafner, Shivada, Okutan, Lopaka, Naijan, and Litten. Team B will be me, Asuna, Agile, Wolfgang, Naza, and Argo. What do you think about this split? This apparently ran counter to their expected groups, and a murmur ran through the gathering before Shivada cut through to ask, So, Team A will be the tanks and Team B is the attackers? That's right. That goes against common theory. Why didn't you split us up evenly? We didn't have quite enough tanks to pull that off. Shivada and Litten are the only ones with shields, so if we pull them into separate parties, they might not hold out long enough for potion rotations. In that case, we should have one party with high defense maintain boss aggro, which should make it easier to manage HP. Of course, that will create a heavier load of our tanks. Shivada shook his head at the last statement and said, Don't worry about that, before continuing with his rebuttal. But if we have all the tanks together, we won't be able to handle them in a wide-ranging simultaneous attacks. Won't that be a problem? Well, just going off the beta, the golem boss of this floor doesn't have any area attacks like breath. It mostly punches, with stomps and different timings for either side. So as long as we manage its hate levels, a single party should be continually able to defend us. Ah, I see, Shivata murmured. I looked around at the other members of the group and added, Of course, I'm going to scout out the boss first to make sure there aren't any unexpected attack types. Once we start from the real, we'll make sure that there's a clear escape route for when the HP's boss gauge changes color, so we can dart out in case any unknown patterns. Yes, we're fighting only with two parties, but we've absolutely got a chance, and I don't intend for us to lose a single member. So to make sure Litten's and Shivada's countdown party is a success, and to ensure that 2023 is a year of hope for all of us, let's pool our strength together and win this battle. For some reason, it turned into a bit of a pep talk at the end, and I was momentarily afraid that I'd overstepped my bounds. Hell yeah, let's do this! Agile roared, pumping a fist, followed by a chorus of approval from the group. I silently thanked the man. 4:15 p.m., December 31st, 2022. The hastily assembled floor boss raid opened the steel doors and set foot inside the labyrinth tower.